I never expected to become the kind of person who locks her bedroom door at family gatherings, but that's exactly who I am now. My name is Lily, and I grew up in a small coastal town, the eldest of three sisters. We shared a bedroom throughout our childhood, built makeshift forts from blankets, and giggled late into the night. Our parents always joked that we were inseparable, but life rarely remains so simple. Over time, money, pride, and unspoken resentments can transform even the warmest bonds into something cold and razor-sharp. For me, that shift became most apparent when I inherited our grandparents' vacation home. At first, I saw it as a chance to preserve a piece of childhood magic. My sisters, on the other hand, saw an investment opportunity. It's incredible how quickly love can turn to opportunism when there's a hefty profit on the line. I was fresh out of college when the news came. My grandfather passed away peacefully in his sleep, leaving behind a sprawling property near the coast. Thick pine forests surrounded the old gabled cottage, and the ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and wet sand through its open windows. That place, with its sagging porch and slightly crooked shutters, felt more like home than anywhere else. Even after I moved out for school, Grandpa insisted I visit whenever possible. He'd teach me how to fix broken floorboards or patch the old roof shingles, telling me that if I wanted to keep a piece of our family's history alive, I had to learn every nook and cranny. When I received the inheritance documents, I realized he had chosen me because he trusted I'd keep the place safe. I never imagined my sisters would resent me for it. At first, Sarah and Nicole acted thrilled. They accompanied me to the reading of the will, offering supportive smiles and gentle pats on my back. But subtle shifts in their behavior started showing once the reality sank in. They began making offhand comments about how expensive upkeep would be and how unfair it was that only one of us got the entire property. "You can't spend all your time there," Sarah said one evening when she and Nicole came over for coffee. "Why not rent it out a few months of the year? That way you can afford the taxes and maintenance." Nicole chimed in, adding, "Plenty of tourists pay top dollar for a place that close to the ocean." Their tone was persuasive, and maybe I'd have considered it if my grandfather's last wish hadn't been so clearly about preserving family tradition, not lining our pockets. I remembered the nights Grandpa would sit on the porch, smoking his pipe while the moonlight shimmered over the water. Sometimes, he'd speak in a hushed voice about how our family's story was woven into the land itself. There was a reason he never rented out the house. He believed it had to remain a genuine family space, somewhere we could go to remember our roots, not a quick source of income. The deeper his stories ran, the more I understood why he'd chosen me. I wasn't exactly wealthy, and I wasn't naive about the costs of maintaining a second home, but I felt compelled to honor his legacy. Sarah and Nicole didn't share that sentiment. They saw the potential for profit. They saw an empty house sitting by the ocean, practically begging to become a short-term rental hotspot. At every family dinner, the topic came up. My sisters tried subtle guilt trips, weaving stories about their kids needing braces or their husbands facing layoffs. They insinuated I was selfish, suggesting that by renting it out, we could all benefit financially. I sympathized, truly. But I also felt a bitter taste of manipulation in every mention of money. Each time, I politely declined, explaining that the house was staying as it was, my personal retreat and a sanctuary for our family gatherings. In response, they began to isolate me. Fewer invitations to birthday parties, less warmth at holidays. Eventually, the overtures turned into demands, and then the demands turned into anger. I was taken aback by how quickly familial love could morph into something so petty, almost predatory. It shook me, but I still refused to budge. Things escalated the week I finalized my plan to renovate the cottage. I hired a local contractor who specialized in historical preservation. We were going to restore the place's vintage charm, repaint the shutters, and ensure the structure stayed sturdy against the region's fierce coastal storms. I was excited, proud that I could finally take care of this home the way my grandfather had always wanted. Then Sarah and Nicole confronted me. They showed up unannounced at my apartment, each wearing a matching look of grim determination. Sarah said, "Look, you're making a mistake. We've talked to some people, and we already have potential renters lined up for the summer. You could make enough to fund all your renovations and still have money left over." Nicole added, "It's not fair for you to keep it all to yourself when we're family. Grandpa would have wanted us all to benefit." I recall my hands shaking, a mixture of anger and heartbreak boiling inside. "You can't possibly think Grandpa would approve of you turning his home into a cash cow," I responded. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of my resolve. They stared, unmoved. Sarah's lips tightened. Nicole looked away. It was then I realized they would never see my point of view because greed and entitlement had blinded them. The conversation ended with a painful standoff. I refused to let them rent the house, and they stormed out, slamming my door so hard the hinges rattled. For weeks afterward, they gave me the silent treatment, ignoring my calls or messages about more neutral family matters. My mother tried to mediate, though even she seemed reluctant to challenge them directly. I felt alone, but I remained firm in my decision. A few months passed. Renovations began. I spent weekends driving out to the cottage, meeting with the contractor and hauling supplies. The process was both exhilarating and exhausting. Late at night, I'd sit on the porch with a thermos of tea, listening to the waves crash. Each time I did, I remembered Grandpa's words about how the sea breeze carried stories from faraway lands. It was solace, a reminder that I was doing the right thing. One Friday, after finishing a long day of painting, I returned to discover my front door had been forced open. The cheap lock I had installed to protect the newly painted interior was shattered. I walked inside, feeling that nauseating surge of dread that comes from knowing someone has intruded. Tools were scattered, and the living room windows were wide open. My immediate thought was that thieves had targeted the place, hoping to steal construction equipment. But as I surveyed the kitchen, I realized nothing significant was missing, just a few random items strewn about. My confusion grew when I noticed footprints tracking dust from the front entrance to the bedrooms. It felt personal, like someone wanted to make a statement rather than simply rob the place. I checked the back door, which was also damaged. That was the moment I sensed a horrible suspicion. Could my sisters have done this? Or their husbands, perhaps? They had made their position painfully clear, and I knew they were frustrated with me. But would they actually break in? It felt unthinkable, and yet a voice in my head whispered that I shouldn't be surprised. Their desperation to gain control over the property seemed bottomless. I called the police immediately, heart pounding, forcing myself to detail every suspicion swirling in my mind. The responding officer seemed sympathetic. He took notes, photographed the damage, and asked if I had any suspects. I hesitated, but I told him I suspected my sister's husbands might be responsible. I mentioned their repeated attempts to pressure me into renting the property, the heated arguments, the sense of entitlement. The officer didn't dismiss my concerns, though he looked wary. Family disputes can get messy, legally speaking, and it's not uncommon for the police to tread carefully. He advised me to secure the property better and suggested that I consider pressing charges if any evidence pointed to my family. He also recommended installing cameras. Before he left, he said something that stuck with me. Family conflicts over inheritance can be the worst. I've seen them tear people apart, so be careful. I nodded, feeling the weight of those words sink in. I replaced the locks, installed deadbolts, and, following the officer's suggestion, set up security cameras around the property. Then I went about my life trying to shake off the violation I felt. My mother reached out, seeming anxious, asking if everything was okay. I didn't mention the break-in, not wanting to spark more chaos. Instead, I said I was tired but managing. The next time I drove out to the cottage, I felt a pang of dread. That sense of violation hadn't faded. I half expected to find more damage, but everything looked intact. Over the next few weeks, the renovations progressed smoothly. My sisters, however, remained distant. I heard through mutual friends that they were furious I'd gone to the police, though they didn't admit to being the culprits. The tension was unnerving, but I refused to cower. If they wanted to rent the house, they'd have to tear it from my hands. About a month after the break-in, I received a frantic call from the security company. An alarm had been triggered at the cottage. I rushed there, arriving just as the police did. 2 squad cars were parked in the gravel driveway, and I saw the door forced open yet again. My stomach twisted in knots. What I didn't expect was to see my sister's husbands, Greg and Thomas, handcuffed on the front porch. Greg's face was flushed with anger. Thomas looked pale, as though he'd been caught doing something unthinkable, and in truth, he had. Police officers were questioning them, while one read them their rights. I noticed a crowbar lying nearby, along with a duffel bag that appeared to contain lockpicking tools. My heart hammered. I wasn't just dealing with suspicion anymore. This was concrete evidence of their crime. As I approached, one officer asked if I was the owner. I confirmed my identity, and the officer explained they had responded to a home alarm and found the two men inside the house, apparently attempting to install new locks. Greg immediately snapped, "This is our family's property. We have a right to access it." The officer gave him a disbelieving look. Thomas tried a calmer approach. "We're just trying to make it more secure," he claimed, voice quivering. But the damage was done. They had no permission to be there, and they'd forced their way in. The crowbar and lockpicks spelled out their intent as clearly as any confession could. I felt a searing mix of rage and heartbreak. They had gone behind my back, thinking they could claim what they believed was rightfully theirs by brute force. The police asked if I wanted to press charges. Initially, I was torn. A part of me, still clinging to some vestige of familial loyalty, hesitated. But then I remembered everything: the entitlement, the manipulation, the break-in, and how they had the audacity to smash my property's security for the sake of profit. They'd left me feeling unsafe in my own home, and they'd tarnished my grandfather's legacy in the process. So I said yes. They'd crossed a line. Let them face the consequences. It was a surreal moment, watching Greg and Thomas being driven away in the back of a squad car. I wondered what Sarah and Nicole would say, how they would justify this outrage. I felt no sympathy, just a hollow ache in my chest as I realized this was likely the point of no return for our family. Shortly after, my phone erupted with calls and text messages. Sarah and Nicole were furious, demanding to know why I'd gotten their husbands arrested. Their tone was dripping with accusatory venom, as if I were the criminal. When I calmly explained that the men had broken into my property, they brushed it off as a misunderstanding. "They just wanted to check on the place," Sarah insisted. "They had no right," I spat back. Nicole went on a tirade about how pressing charges would ruin their families financially. It was a side of my sisters I'd never seen before: cruel, manipulative, and completely unwilling to accept any accountability. I hung up on them after telling them the same phrase over and over: "I'm done." There was nothing more to say. Forgiveness was off the table. All that remained was the legal process they had brought upon themselves. In the weeks that followed, the drama escalated. Sarah and Nicole tried to rally extended family members against me. A few relatives reached out, warning me that I was being too harsh. They argued that a family dispute shouldn't be settled in court. But I held firm. No one who truly cared about me or understood the situation could honestly believe that breaking into someone's home was an innocent act. The security footage made everything abundantly clear anyway. There was no ambiguity about what Greg and Thomas had been doing. My lawyer suggested we pursue felony charges for burglary, given the forced entry and the intention to change locks, presumably to claim the property. I agreed. The idea of them facing serious consequences was no longer horrifying to me. It felt just. My sense of betrayal overrode any lingering guilt. I decided to stay at the cottage more often, ensuring no further incidents occurred. The tension with my sisters weighed on me, but a stubborn part of me refused to let them bully me out of my inheritance. If they thought I'd fold under pressure, they were mistaken. My father tried to mediate, but it was too late. This was no longer a petty argument. It was a matter of principle. Greg and Thomas had their bail hearing, and a restraining order was put in place. They weren't allowed within a certain distance of my property. I remember standing in the courthouse hallway, listening to my sisters curse my name. Their fury was palpable, yet beneath it, I sensed a desperation. They realized they'd overplayed their hand. The law was on my side, and there was no easy way out. With the legal proceedings looming, I found an unexpected ally: the local contractor I'd hired for the renovations. He had witnessed odd behavior from Greg and Thomas on prior occasions, times when they'd shown up unannounced and snooped around. He offered to testify, providing a timeline that corroborated my account. Meanwhile, the police had clear evidence from the second break-in. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They broke in with the intention of occupying or altering the property without my consent. It wasn't just a family squabble over keys, it was a criminal act. Sarah and Nicole tried to spin the narrative, but every time they claimed this was a misunderstanding, they were met with skepticism. They'd lost whatever moral high ground they once thought they had. At that point, I felt more resolved than ever to see this through. When the trial began, it was nerve-wracking but cathartic. I testified, recounting how my sisters had repeatedly badgered me for the right to rent out the house, how their husbands had broken in not once, but twice, how I had found the crowbar and lockpicking tools. The prosecution presented the security footage, showing Greg and Thomas entering the property without permission, damaging the door, and rummaging around. My sisters sat in the gallery, glaring daggers at me. There were times I looked away, feeling the weight of their hatred. But I reminded myself of Grandpa's voice, how he'd told me that this cottage was more than just a building. It was our family's story. And now, these men had tried to steal it in the name of greed. I wasn't going to back down. Perhaps the most surreal moment came when Greg took the stand in his own defense. He tried to paint a picture of me as unstable, claiming I'd invited him to help with repairs, and then twisted the story. The prosecution swiftly dismantled his narrative, pointing out the obvious break-in evidence and showing text messages where I had explicitly warned them to stay away. Thomas tried a similar approach, feigning confusion about the property's ownership. By the end of cross-examination, it was clear they were grasping at straws. The jury deliberated briefly, and the verdict came back. Guilty. Even though these were my brothers-in-law, I felt no remorse. They had shown no respect for me, for Grandpa's wishes, or for the sanctity of private property. They received probation and hefty fines, narrowly avoiding jail time thanks to a plea agreement. The judge made it clear they were lucky. Walking out of the courtroom, I caught a glimpse of Sarah and Nicole. Tears streaked their faces, but their eyes burned with hatred. They didn't apologize or attempt a moment of reconciliation. In that instant, I realized that we were done as a family. There would be no healing from this. They had tried to exploit what was never theirs to begin with. They'd let their husbands commit a crime for the sake of profit and then blamed me for seeking justice. I recalled the cozy nights of our childhood, the sound of our laughter echoing in shared beds. It felt like a lifetime ago, lost under the weight of betrayal. I turned away and walked down the courthouse steps. I thought, perhaps this is where our family story truly ends, scattered like grains of sand on a lonely beach. My mother tried to contact me the following week, sobbing into the phone, begging me to drop the restraining order so that we could all just move on. I told her it wasn't up to me anymore, that the wheels of justice were in motion, and that the men had already been convicted. "But they're your sister's husbands," she cried. "And they tried to steal from me," I retorted. I didn't raise my voice. I'd never felt calmer in stating a fact. The conversation ended with her pleading for unity, but I couldn't see a path to that. I was done pretending that family harmony was worth ignoring repeated violations. My father also made an attempt at bridging the gap, but I shut it down. I'd spent enough time trying to reason with people who had none. Determined to move forward, I threw myself into finishing the renovations. Each coat of fresh paint felt like an act of defiance, a promise to myself and to Grandpa that this house would remain a family treasure on my terms. The local community, having heard rumors of the scandal, was surprisingly supportive. A neighbor dropped by with homemade cookies and told me how proud my grandfather would be. Others helped me move furniture around, refusing payment. It was a humbling experience, seeing how strangers could be kinder than my own flesh and blood. As the final touches were made, a new porch swing, replaced shutters, and a fresh garden plot, I finally saw the cottage the way I'd always pictured it. Renewed, yet faithful to its history, standing proud against the shore. And I felt at peace. I never looked back. They had chosen greed. I embraced loyalty. In the end, justice wasn't just a legal victory, it was my liberation. The cottage still stands, untainted. Though our family is shattered, I remain triumphant and resolute, guarding Grandpa's legacy without regret.